when we touch this place of emptiness and silence, especially if there is a sweetness to it, we think that's what we're looking for. And we can spend a lifetime cultivating that and waiting for one day when we've cultivated it such that our whole life is filled with this empty silence sweetness. And if our life isn't filled with that sweetness that we can experience, not really we as the individual, but can be experienced when meditation happens, especially the deep, deep meditations where we could say it's a different state of consciousness. If that's not in our life all the time, we might think we're not quite there yet. And so then we'll be waiting till that is our life, where there maybe there's many ideas about what it's finally going to look like. Whether there won't be a person anymore. Maybe I'll be so immersed in bliss that there's no need to ever leave wherever I happen to be overcome with this bliss. That's where I'll spend the rest of my life, immersed in an inner bliss. And I'd suggest that what is available to the human being, what I am quite certain about, although let's use the word certain relatively, so maybe it's not the right word, but in reading the scriptures, in reading all of the accounts of what liberation is, if you read in between the lines, if you don't read just one sentence, if you read it in a whole context, what's being pointed at is something much simpler than the very sweet and profound states that are available. So enjoy them, and if you find yourself feeling like you're shifting into that state at a particular point in time, if you feel like you want to go to a cave and meditate, and in that cave there is something special that happens unexplainably, and we find these deep, deep states of consciousness. By all means, that's part of the beauty in life. And we should enjoy that. So if we feel like doing it, let's do it. But the state that is available on a continuous, unbroken basis as we move through life is much simpler than that, much plainer than that. And in this teaching, it's referred to as peace of mind. Peace of mind in daily living. Peace of mind in daily living, regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. And peace of mind is the absence of something. So it's waking up in the morning with something missing. Something that life seems to have put in place as a default arising in humanity and in human beings. And that which is missing, when peace of mind is there on a continuous, unbroken basis, is what we can call suffering. And suffering isn't the suffering of a broken arm. That's what we would call pain in this particular framework. The suffering is an uncomfortableness with oneself and an uncomfortableness with the other. And when we find ourselves uncomfortable with the other, really we're uncomfortable with ourselves when we look into that blame towards the other, which when we feel it, and it's very important to feel. Now, I'm putting forward words, concepts that are really just pointers to our internal and external landscape, pointers to dynamics that are common to everyone. And it's important to be able to feel what is being pointed at. If we don't feel the blame, for example, when it arises, we'll just hear a concept about blame. Blame arises when the other delivers pain to us, and we say, "You hurt me, I hate you." That's the conceptual description of blame, but we can feel it when it arises. You know, you said that I could buy this motorbike off you for this amount, and now I come and you say you've sold it to someone else. You know, this just isn't how things should happen. And an internal uncomfortableness with the other in the form of blame becomes part of our experience. And that blame is there because as part of our makeup, we believe that we need certain things in order to be complete. And in that sort of lead up to going to buy the bike, we started to feel like, yes, this is going to make me more complete. This pleasure in my life is going to complete me. And so when that's disturbed, when that pleasure is taken away because of the actions of another, we say, you have taken away a part of what would make me complete. You've hurt me, I hate you. And it arises as a disturbance to the peace of mind that is there if that isn't arising. And the different layers of suffering are many and differing in intensity. Some of the suffering is very, very fundamental. We might suffer just because we find ourselves awake, having to deal with life without anything specifically going wrong. Some people's composition, makeup, is such that there is an anxiety, a hopelessness, a fear, just because they find themselves awake, knowing that what they're going to be facing for the next 14 hours is the flow of pleasure and pain in life. And so if life changes us in such a way that this suffering no longer arises, then we find our life hasn't necessarily changed as significantly as we might imagine the change to be. We might find that we still find ourselves in our day-to-day circumstance, having to function according to the circumstance we find ourselves in. But without the arising of suffering that tends to contract and fill what is otherwise this fairly vast, or a vast open space. And so that's what I'm suggesting this search is about. It's a movement away from a way of relating to life where suffering is continually arising based on circumstance where either oneself functions, performs in a certain way that delivers pain, or because the other delivers pain. And as a result, we have an attitude that says this pain that happened because of what I did or happened because of what you did is an attack on who I am, and therefore I feel uncomfortable and I hate myself or I hate the other. And then similarly with that way of seeing things in place, when an outcome is positive, the opposite of shame kicks in, pride. And so what this set of pointers is aiming to show us or to describe to us are the range of dynamics that happen, and describe things in ways that we don't ordinarily get them described to us in. So all of the concepts are exactly that, concepts. So you don't need to really listen with too much of your intellect. Because if we do, and the concepts are laid out in a way that is fairly linear and logical. So if we get too involved in trying to work it all out with our intellect, what is referred to as the sense of personal doership that is attached to an outcome kicks in. So it's very valid that if you feel like just being open and maybe even drifting away when I'm talking, if you find that your thinking is getting too caught up with what I'm saying, then that's fine, because the human body is far, far more intelligent than we're capable of understanding. There's a lot of information. I think it's really, really important information because it disrupts the current status quo. But it's not all going to be disruptive in one moment. So allow yourself to drift off if it feels like that will be helpful. So if we start, before I lay out some more of the framework, with this very important question. We say, I'm a seeker. I've been seeking for X number of years. And I suggest that if that's the case, you ask yourself the question, what am I really seeking? You have to be very clear on what you're seeking, and I don't suggest you come up with the answer based on what you think you're seeking. I'm not suggesting that you come up with the answer that you think feels right. Because unfortunately, part of what keeps us in suffering is that we think we are seeking something, we think we are right about what we're seeking, and it turns out that what we're seeking is based on misunderstanding. So the suggestion is that we ask this very important question. It's a good question, isn't it? If we're going to spend years traveling from one place to another on a spiritual quest, reading many books, it seems like a good question. What is it that I'm really seeking? Understanding that the answer that your system has in place is part of probably what has been causing the sense of disconnection from oneself. So there's a suggestion as to what the answer to that question is. The suggested answer is that whether we realize it or not, the human being is seeking happiness. However, the human being has concluded, based on how we've been designed and how the senses operate and how the cognition and everything has formed, the human being has concluded my happiness is to be found in outcomes. My happiness is to be found when I get something that I don't have. And so the seeking for happiness starts from a very young age. And whenever something is taken away that we believe will give us happiness, there is this big resistance to life. So these are descriptions I'm describing. Now, it's a concept, it's not the truth, right? I can't describe the truth of the universe. From a certain perspective, things will be relatively true. So these are descriptions that are very valid as part of the search. So we're all seeking happiness. There's no problem with seeking happiness, but seeking happiness in the wrong place is futile. And humanity seems to have become convinced, forced to become convinced, that happiness is to be found in outcomes. And the suggestion here is happiness is available for the human being. Happiness is available for the human being in a very special way. And that happiness can be continuous and unbroken for the rest of your life. And the happiness is not happiness through pleasure, not happiness through the avoidance of pain, but happiness in the form of unbroken peace of mind in daily living. It's available in that form because peace of mind is the falling away of something, the stopping of a certain habit, a certain functioning of the human being. If happiness was to be found in the gaining of something, then I don't think that we can find a continuous, unbroken happiness in life. Because life is, in its nature, the flow of life, circumstance, is always going to be a mix of pleasure and pain. Life is transient and transitioning and changing. So you can't hope to find something that is going to be there and unchanging. So if the happiness was about finding something we don't have and then holding on to it, given the nature of life, I don't think that happiness would be available. However, the happiness that is the ending of something is more likely, especially if what it is that ends is not part of the flow of life, not part of circumstance, but it's the ending of a certain attitude to circumstance. And we find that the attitude to circumstance that delivers the suffering is based on two deeply ingrained beliefs in the system. One, my happiness is to be found in outcomes. Two, I am a separate independent entity in complete control of everything I think, feel, say and do. And the other is a separate independent entity in complete control of everything they think, feel, say and do. So these are two deeply ingrained beliefs about who we are. I believe myself to be something that is incomplete and will become complete when circumstance becomes pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And I believe myself to be a separate independent entity in complete control of everything that I think, everything that I say, and everything that I do. So the belief in personal doership and the belief in, or the belief that is attachment to outcomes. With a little bit of investigation, we will start to see that these two beliefs are completely erroneous, false, untrue. And when the system that contains the belief, the misunderstanding, recognizes that the misunderstanding is incorrect, it starts to dissolve. And if that misunderstanding is in place and it flowers into suffering, that's what that belief, I am the doer, I am in control of everything that happens, and my happiness is to be found in pleasure. That forces guilt, blame and pride, worry and expectation to continually arise as part of our experience in life, depending on whether the circumstance is pleasurable or painful. So if that belief system forces that suffering to arise, we're doomed to a life of suffering. So the Buddha has said in the Four Noble Truths, the first noble truth, life is suffering. That was a recognition. That's sort of, the Four Noble Truths are a description of a progression of understanding. And the first understanding was the recognition. Life is suffering. Now, it can sound depressing to recognize that. But whenever we recognize something for what it is, whenever we're honest, it means we're seeing things as they are. There's a clarity in that. It turns out it's not so depressing, because the subsequent recognitions is there is a way out of suffering. You can't come to the second one until you recognize the first one. So the description here is that peace of mind is the end of suffering. Peace of mind is, when it sets in, the happiness we've always been looking for. It's not debatable. It's when it's there, it's like I don't need things to be different. I'm not uncomfortable with myself. I'm not uncomfortable with the other. I'm not uncomfortable with life. What more could one ask for? If someone said, well, how about I swap that for what, $100 million? No way, thank you. Not a chance. I'm not interested. Why? Why would you take money in exchange for finding yourself at peace with life? And it's not, I'm saying that to sort of demonstrate that in the peace of mind, when it's recognized that what it is the complete absence of a resistance to life, that it confirms, this is what I'm looking for. If someone said, well, let's not worry about the $100 million, that's a bit materialistic. What about these levels of bliss and ananda that are available in life? I say, I don't know that they're available in life, and I don't, frankly, care much for them. But aren't you interested? I said, well, if they came, I'm sure they'd be enjoyable. But the peace of mind is the end of expectation, the end of seeking for happiness out there. And it all stems from the dissolving of the false idea of who we are, the false ingrained beliefs, which allow a resting inside. So it's the end of seeking for oneself outside and a turning inward. Now, if we're seeking happiness out there, to just stop and B seems like a waste of time. It's like, well, why would I stop in B when I'm very busy trying to get somewhere, trying to find something? So who put these beliefs in place? Who put this set of beliefs, which I've described it in its broad sense, and underneath my happiness is to be found in outcomes and I'm the doer, there's a whole range of much more specific beliefs that sort of branch off those main beliefs. One of the most prevalent, especially for those people without partners, is that when I have a partner, then everything will be okay. So that is the attachment to outcome. Attachment to love is the more specific outcome that's there. And while that is in place, there automatically arises a sense of something missing. Because the belief is saying, I'm not complete now. And we didn't put this dynamic in place. We're not responsible for things being the way they are. But when we look, we find it's there. So life puts these beliefs in place, and it's life that undoes them. Through new conditioning, it put the beliefs in place through the way we experience life and the way that what is experienced is processed. And from what we hear from society that has evolved in the way that I've just described, experiencing life and then drawing certain conclusions. And those conclusions are, it turns out to be not so accurate. So society is telling us your happiness is to be found in outcomes. And so we're continually being bombarded with conditioning from society, conditioning from our family, and experiencing life through the senses, and a certain makeup gets put in place. And it's not our fault. It's a result of an impersonal process of growing. So the human being essentially is a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. And remember, these descriptions are descriptions that are relative and useful specifically to this question of peace of mind in daily living. I'm not putting forward concepts that might be accurate in relation to genetic science or different other objectives. But in relation to peace of mind in daily living, the concepts are specifically relevant. So the human being is a result of their genes and up-to-date conditioning. Now, genes really means, the blueprint that gets formed when the sperm and the egg come together, and a growing process happens. And we don't do the growing, and we're a result of the growing. We didn't decide what color eyes we have, or whether our muscles are the twitch muscle is fast or slow, what biological preferences we had, what our IQ is. So whatever happens, if your hair starts falling out, we say that's part of your genes, meaning the biological intelligence that grows. And then at some point it starts to do the opposite of growing. When it starts getting older, it starts breaking down. Genes, the sperm and the egg come together, a growing process happens, and from the moment that conception happens, there is conditioning from the environment on that organism. And the conditioning plus the genes, once they meet, they become one thing. The organism at any point in time is a result of the genetics growing and the up-to-date conditioning. And we didn't control any of those factors. So in each moment we're one way. So if we could take a snapshot of us, we're one way in this moment. We have our beliefs and everything is contained as it is, as a result of these genes and up-to-date conditioning that we had no control over. So we will function one way. If we function in a way where circumstance brings up a big load of blame, then that's not our doing. This is what the notion of non-doership is pointing at. That everyone is functioning exactly according to God's will, or the will of Source, or according to life. Everyone is part of life, not separate from life. Life has brought them into existence. Life has grown us and life has conditioned us. And everyone is functioning according to life, according to God's will, not my will. Now, this mightn't seem so significant if we don't keep in mind the objective. What are we really looking for in life? If we're looking for the end of suffering, it makes sense to understand on what basis does the suffering arise. And none of what I'm saying is meant to be an intellectual discussion. They're descriptions that hopefully become part of your up-to-date conditioning. And as you go out into your daily living, hopefully the descriptions start to land on the dynamics that are being described. And maybe for the first time, with importance or with a relevance, a thought arises, there's the blame arising that is disturbing my peace of mind. So if these dynamics of doership and attachment to outcome do change, what you're likely to find is a lot more silence. The absence of the psychological load of guilt, blame and pride, worry and expectation. So it's very valid that in any moment, if you realize that the thinking mind is functioning, in any moment, stop is valid. You don't need to do an investigation. So if you have a meditation practice and you can close your eyes and become still, that's great. But what about out in daily living? It may be that we practice meditating, and then out in daily living, the link isn't necessarily made, whereby we understand that in practice, in practical daily living, it's the guilt and the blame and the pride and the worry and the expectation that is preventing us from being quiet in daily living. And if the underlying dynamics aren't looked at, then they'll remain in place. We'll find ourselves at times, maybe you can be in meditation for 5 hours a day, and then you go out into daily life, and the ingrained beliefs, which are really, in Ramana's terminology, it's the vasanas and the samskaras that need to work themselves out. They don't just work themselves out, they work themselves out on the basis of an understanding. It's not, I have had some shift and now it's just a matter of time for the remaining vasanas and samskaras to work themselves out. It's, yes, they will work themselves out, but the dynamics that are at the bottom of them need to be understood. That will be part of the process of them working themselves out. So today a friend saw me on the street, and he came up to me and he was a little shaken up because of a circumstance that had just happened. And he explained an accommodation situation that had happened, whereby the owners of the guest house had accepted him in on certain terms, and then after day one, the terms that they had agreed to weren't available as they said they would be, so there was a second night that was different to what was really wanted. And after the second day, it became apparent that they really were trying to be a bit dishonest and just get as much money out of the situation as possible. And so, on the description of the circumstance, this person had been wronged by the owners of the guest house. It seemed pretty clear. And so I was listening to the situation, and I think there was a request for some advice. And I said, look, as far as I would look at it, according to the teaching framework, everything that happens is God's will. It was your destiny to receive this pain as part of your life. And it was the destiny of the guest house owners to deliver that pain to you. So they were the instruments through which the pain you were destined to receive was delivered. Your continuing resistance on a psychological level to the situation that is now finished, because you've checked out of the guest house, having seen that that was the case, is only going to add another layer of uncomfortableness on top of the painful situation of having paid more than you wanted to, or at least, if not having paid more than you wanted to, having to have checked out in protest and now not having anywhere to stay until you find a new place. So if we can start to see the unfolding flow of life, which is always going to be a mix of pleasure and pain, as a happening according to God's will, understanding that until the day that we die, we have to continue to live life as a human being, experiencing the flow of life, which means experiencing sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain. If we can come to see that our whole life is essentially, from the point of view of the individual, we can say predetermined. I will experience what is predetermined as it happens in each moment. And what is predetermined is essentially a mix of pleasure and pain, circumstance, as well as the attitude to the circumstance that happens to be there at that point in time. So if blame happens and it stretches out over the next, let's say, 3 days about this circumstance, the blame in relation to the circumstance is also predetermined. Which means not your doing. The resistance that we have towards life is when we engage in life with an attitude of personal doership. The attitude of personal doership means I should have done something differently. I regret not having done something differently. The owner of the guest house, in this case, should have kept their word, should have honored the agreement. And that attitude is an attitude that forgets that each of us have been, we're an extrusion of life. We've come out of life, and we've been grown by life, we've been shaped by life. And each of us are functioning exactly the way that we're destined and designed to function. So the attitude of doership forgets that. And the narrative about what should and shouldn't have happened kicks in. That's the suffering. And all it does is add a much, much heavier load of uncomfortableness with oneself onto the inevitable, unavoidable, it's happened, pain in the moment. And it's important to remember our happiness, our completion, our completeness is not to be found in the flow of life. And that statement, your happiness is not to be found in the flow of life, is essentially a reminder to where we started from. And where we started from was what we're seeking for is happiness. But happiness is available in a very special form, happiness through peace of mind, not happiness through pleasure. If our happiness was a happiness through pleasure, 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 we might as well hang up our boots and say, not available in this life, because the flow of life is never going to be pleasure, 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 and you can try as hard as you like to control it. And in essence, trying to control life so that it is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure all the time is as futile as looking at a avalanche coming down a mountain and asking it to move a little bit to the left, please, a little bit to the right. It's not something we can control. It's a force of its own. And we are trapped, in a sense, in the flow of life. trapped in the flow of pleasure and pain. Where the freedom can be is in our attitude to the pleasure and pain. So some of you heard Gautam mention Nisargadatta's quote that references him being in between the shores of pleasure and pain, and that in the middle I am. So the I amness, the core of the human being, is unaffected by the pleasure or pain of life. Now this is something that we can find out for ourselves. It requires us to find ourselves in a painful situation, probably involved in the painful situation in the form of guilt or blame or worry, expectation, and then remember, I exist, I am independent of the pleasure or pain. And if a movement internally has started to form where a stopping can happen and a dropping out of the thinking mind can happen, then experientially we'll experience ourselves dropping into our own being, remembering, I exist. I exist independent of the fact that I've missed my aeroplane, independent of the fact that I've been cheated. I am. And you come back and rest there. And a little smile comes to your face. That's your own recognition that your happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life. The attachment to outcome isn't interested in I am, it's interested in defending and getting. And so if that's where we live life from, there's a disconnection from our true self. And if that connection doesn't happen in a particular instance, where the thought, I am, arises, let's say, and we find that a dropping into our being just doesn't happen, the suffering is too intense, the thinking mind is too engaged in the situation, then maybe a witnessing of the blame can happen. Just seeing the blame happening as a powerful force and understanding, that blame is happening because there's a deeply ingrained self-identity that includes attachment to outcomes. And therefore the blame towards the other, seeing the other as the doer and seeing the other as the one that has delivered the pain or taken my pleasure away, means that I have to hate them. I have to wish ill on them. And the witnessing of that blame is a beautiful thing, because it's a huge step towards the ending of the blame. Our logic says, if the aim is the end of blame, then I have to stop the blame. Nothing in these talks is meant to be an instruction to a doer to do anything. All of the descriptions are exactly that, just descriptions that may allow, if they become part of your up-to-date conditioning, a landing, an effortless landing of attention with the aid of the intellect on a seeing of a dynamic that previously wasn't seen. So you don't have to do witnessing. You don't have to do the end of blame. If the seeker kicks in and says, okay, you've told me that peace of mind is what's available. Peace of mind is the end of blame, therefore I have to stop blaming. That I that is going to control the situation is the doer, attached to an outcome. And that's inevitably going to kick in. Hopefully we're armed to catch it at some point, because it will feel uncomfortable. All forms of suffering, including the I must stop the blame. Why am I still blaming when I know I should stop the blame? Is a form of suffering. It's a form of doership and attachment to outcome, and it feels uncomfortable. Once we register what this uncomfortable feeling feels like, in a way what's happened is it's like calibrating a radar system. And whenever an uncomfortable feeling arises, we may be prompted to recognize, so blame or shame or expectation is happening. Without insisting that it stops, just a recognition of it. And as it's recognized, a huge amount of attention and awareness is going on to dynamics that previously we were completely involved in. So I won't talk for too much longer without giving an opportunity for some questions. Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hello.
So I understood you said the ordinary people, they look for happiness like in a new car or something, and the seeker is actually looking for a quiet mind. What's the difference between a new car and a quiet mind? They're both objects, and happiness is not to be found in the flow of life. The unquiet mind is the flow of life. A quiet mind is the flow of life. So even a quiet mind is part of the flow of life. Sometimes you have it, sometimes not.
Mm-hmm.
So can you please explain?
Yeah. So it's a good question. It's not how I see it in a sense that the flow of life is has a very specific definition in this framework. So the flow of life talks about circumstance. Meaning, you order your meal at the restaurant and it comes and it's the wrong meal, for example. So the ordering of the meal, can I please have, lentil salad, is part of the flow of life. The thinking, what would I like to order, and looking at the menu is part of the flow of life. So thought can be part of the flow of life. A specific type of thinking can be part of the flow of life. It's very specific to the circumstance or part of the circumstance. So the looking at the menu, thinking about what I will order, placing the order with the waiter, and then a few minutes or half an hour later, 10 minutes later, the food comes and it's the wrong dish, right? So all of that is circumstance. And the flow, I'm glad you asked this question, because it's a nuanced part of the teaching that I don't often talk about, but I always want to talk about it. So the flow of life, if you listen to it just once or twice, the teaching, you might not realize, although you've heard it a few more than once or twice, I think, you might not realize that there's very specific words. So the flow of life is one of these specific words or phrases. And it is talking about circumstance. Now, life is different to the flow of life in this framework, in this description. Life means the flow of life plus your attitude to the flow of life. Right? So the flow of life is the circumstance, and then the attitude that we have to the flow of life, the two together is life overall. So life overall means two layers. The flow of life, circumstance. Circumstance is always pleasure or pain. And then the attitude to the flow of life, which is either peace or suffering. Right? So the attitude to the flow of life, which in a way you could say is the quiet mind or the not quiet mind, is outside of the flow of life. Right? But part of life. Part of life. So if someone who isn't a seeker is convinced that they are seeking happiness in the form of a car, for example, it's an object, part of circumstance, meaning pleasure. They get a new car, which is the circumstance, and they sit in it and they smell the new car smell, and they feel great for the first few weeks driving. Each time they walking up to the car, they say, well, what a lovely, look at that car, it's beautiful. The designers of this have done a fantastic job, and now this is my car. And there's nothing wrong with pleasure. The problem is when our attitude to the pleasure, our attitude to the circumstance is such that the circumstance starts to or is part of who we believe we are on a deep level. Now, after a while, our own life experience tells us that having the new car won't deliver continuous, unbroken happiness in our life. It will deliver pleasure for a while, and even it might deliver pleasure for 20 years. You might say, every time I walk up to the car, I'm impressed at the design of that car. So it can deliver pleasure. But we know that the fact that we have the car in our name doesn't mean that when someone hurts us, that we find ourselves still happy in life. And so what we come to see very quickly is from our own experience that the material gain of things is not an answer. We have our own experience of that. The quiet mind, as I'm describing it, is the absence of the noisy mind, the uncomfortable mind, the hatred towards the person that scratched your beautiful car, right? The scratch is the circumstance, and it's painful. It's not what you would like. It's not in line with your preferences. If it was understood that that's life, that's a quiet mind. The pain is there. You still have to pay $300 to get the scratch fixed. So financial pain, inconvenience of having to go and be without the car for a week and catching public transport or whatever. So that pain is still there. The attitude to the circumstance is either one of doership and attachment to outcome, and the doership and attachment to outcomes means that you are so angry for an extended period of time that this has happened. If you find out who it is and they won't admit to it, you hate them. Each time you see them on the street, you are not at peace with them, not at peace with yourself. The quiet mind is the absence of that. So I would say that if we can see, it's still, in a sense, it's still an outcome. Right? It's true. Because if you look at life as a whole, not just the flow of life, but life as a whole, you either have a scratch with the blame or a scratch with peace of mind. And so it's an outcome. Blame is an outcome, you can say, but it's not an outcome in the flow of life. It's an outcome on the attitudinal level, which is part of your whole life experience. So the framework, because you're right, if we look at it as life overall, it's an outcome. The absence of something is an outcome. But when we start to see that there is the pleasure and pain level, which is what's referred to as the flow of life, and the attitudinal level, and it's saying that your happiness is not to be found as an outcome in the flow of life. Your happiness is to be found as an outcome in your attitude to life.
Yeah, but for me, these are all objects. Even the right attitude of life is an object which I try to acquire in hope in future this will give me peace. And I'm looking for the peace which includes a quiet and an unquiet mind, a happy and an unangry, or a happy or angry me. So what about that?
Yes, it's a good.
And can that what I call I find any peace at all, as long as still there is an I? I mean, you mentioned in the beginning, no, let's say the other way around. As I understood, Ramana said that what believes I am me, I am my body, my feeling, will never find any peace anyway, because it is made of unpeace.
Yeah, so that me is what I'm referring to as the doer and attachment to outcome, the false sense of self. So the me that is the false sense of self will never acquire peace of mind, because that me is suffering. So the me is not the person as a whole. The me is a form of conditioning that is part of the person, a set of beliefs that have been inserted as part of the overall makeup of the person. The me is the part of the person that is convinced that my happiness is to be found in the flow of life, so I need life to be perfect one day. And when life isn't perfect, there is a resistance to life not being perfect, and the belief that I'm the one doing it and the other is the one doing it. So that is the false sense of self that prevents us from knowing ourselves as a human being free of that dynamic. So what you mentioned is a very good point, because if someone takes the description that happiness is continuous unbroken peace of mind, and it's the doership aspect that holds on to that, what has happened is it has turned it into an expectation, right? The doer says, oh, that sounds great, I want it. I as the doer want it. So I am going to get it. I am going to make it happen. So they have heard the description, turned it into an expectation that they are going to make happen. Now, that entity is not going to be happy. That dynamic is not going to be able to get that happiness. In fact, that dynamic is going to find that when blame arises, it says, hey, blame is not peace of mind. And I want peace of mind. I have no interest in anything else other than peace of mind. I insist on peace of mind. That is my expectation. And therefore, there is going to be a psychological fight going on because peace of mind isn't there. So what you've pointed at is essential. That there has to be a stage where we understand that the suffering is a happening, not my doing. The blame is a happening according to my makeup, according to my design. Life has designed me such that there is the belief in personal doership. I do see the other as the one that has made this happen. And because I see them as the one that's made this happen, I hate them. Right? If life has shaped us like that, we have to hate the other. Right? It's not optional. If life has also shaped us to hear that happiness is available in peace of mind, in the form of peace of mind, and then it gets us to hold on to that as an expectation, then there's going to be even more suffering. Right? So what you're pointing at is that the me has to stop insisting on life looking any way in particular. So if suffering arises, part of the human being hopefully will see that and say, that is a happening, that's life. Right? So no resistance to the blame arising. That means that the primary resistance of the blame has happened, but now no secondary involvement in the blame. Whereas the alternative is the primary blame happens, and then the secondary involvement that says, I shouldn't be blaming. I know that blaming is not helping me. In fact, blame is obscuring my peace of mind. Why do I keep blaming? I'm such a failure. I've been doing this for so long. So that's the primary involvement in the pain of the circumstance as blame towards the person, and then secondary involvement in the form of guilt. I'm not good enough. Shame. So we have to be able to accept the suffering when it arises as a happening. But that is not complete peace of mind. That is a hugely important step towards peace of mind, because there is a non-involvement in the primary involvement. It has to happen. If we find ourselves accepting the suffering, we should bow down and be very grateful to life for having put in place the understanding that if I don't accept my suffering, that's just more suffering. But if we become complacent, or not so much complacent actually, if we misunderstand and think the peace is the peace that is at peace with the suffering and the peace of mind, then, and it is, there is a much bigger degree of peace when we are at peace with the suffering when it's there and the peace of mind when it's there. However, if we become convinced of that, then the movement that becomes interested in the remaining suffering stops. And it might remain like that for a long time. So it's a very fine line as to how we investigate. Investigate, but without attachment to outcome.
Does that mean you have always peace of mind? You're not getting angry?
Now there's a...
Well, we all know Ramana was getting very emotional in the kitchen.
Yeah.
If you ever seen a video of Nisargadatta, he doesn't look like he's always in peace of mind. He was full of fire, getting angry, throwing people out. So
Nisargadatta, this is another great question, because it starts to pick apart the teaching concepts so that we can become clearer on them. So there is a big difference between biological reaction and psychological reaction. Now, the psychological reaction is the suffering, the guilt, the blame, the pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes. Those are the psychological reactions that happen horizontally in time after an event has happened. The event happens. The event includes a biological reaction to the event, and then the psychological suffering extends in time, sometimes for months or years or a whole lifetime, about a particular circumstance that happened. Nisargadatta got angry, a biological reaction of anger in the moment. In the next moment, he was laughing with the person. Get out. How many times do I have to tell you? The same thing. That's it. Get out. And then someone makes a joke and he starts laughing. The person asks a question, the one he told to get out, and he's talking to them again. Because the biological reaction is not suffering. And this is a huge mistake. If we think that peace of mind means being peaceful on the outside, that's a huge expectation that's going to lead to frustration, because the human being has a biological makeup. It has its biological preferences, and it has a biological intelligence. And in some situations, without you even thinking about it, there is a biological requirement for anger. Now, the anger is... the biological reaction has no capacity to think in the same way as the doership and attachment to outcomes. It doesn't think, I need this in order to survive. It's a reaction. If someone were to come at you with, a knife, you're going to see the knife. It's a biological threat, and you're going to either freeze. That would be a biological reaction. You're either going to fight back, a biological reaction, or run away. And all of those, whichever happens, and we don't know which one happens till it happens in the moment, and for different people they will have different biological reactions. Those are all valid biological reactions. The psychological reaction happens after that, with our attitude to what has happened, the attitude that says, why did this person come running at me with a knife? How, they shouldn't have done that. And it carries, well, I mean, it's quite an extreme example. You'll probably tell your friends about it, but even that can be without blame and hatred if that dynamic has fallen away in us. Then we might, if we ran away, afterwards we say, why did I run away? That's so cowardly. I shouldn't have run away. None of that psychological narrative would happen in Ramana or Nisargadatta. But if Ramana saw someone chopping the carrots in big things and he's told them 20 times to cut them, hey, how many times do I have to tell you? A biological reaction based on seeing something that was out of line with his biological preferences. And yet internally, especially once the situation is over and left, he's not there thinking, that useless chef and I hate them. That's the difference. That's the quiet mind. So it's fantastic that life puts sages like, not so much Ramana, because, well, much more like Nisargadatta, that shows us, it gets us to, how can he be a sage if he's getting angry at people? It's because he has no shoulds or shouldn'ts. The shoulds and shouldn'ts, which are part of the ingrained belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, how I should live my life, how I shouldn't live my life, based on what I think psychologically will give me happiness, have completely collapsed in the sage. And life is then living spontaneously through them without this layer of shoulds and shouldn'ts and so. And the thinking, our thinking mind might say, but if my shoulds and shouldn'ts collapse, then I might do anything. And it's not quite like that, because when your shoulds and shouldn'ts collapse, you will live life according to your biological preferences. And your biological preferences are probably such that you won't pick up a gun and go and start shooting people. You haven't done it so far in your life. So the dropping of the shoulds and shouldn'ts isn't going to suddenly mean that you are radically different on a biological, structural basis. So we can be very surprised that the shoulds and shouldn'ts fall away. And in fact, we find life happening through us in a very efficient way. So once we've made this distinction of the difference between biological anger, for example, and biological sadness, when someone came and told Ramana that his childhood friend, who he had spent nearly his whole life with, had died when he was in his village, a tear came to his eyes. Right? That is a sign of emotional pain. Emotional pain, just like anger, is a biological reaction, and it's not suffering. And then after 30 seconds or so, he clapped his hands and went, lunchtime. So the end of attachment to outcome doesn't mean the end of biological pleasure or pain, which can include emotional pleasure or pain. The emotions are not part of the doership and attachment to outcomes. So my experience is, because I also think this is a good question, you should ask someone that's talking to you what their experience of life is. So my experience of life is that suffering doesn't arise in life. It hasn't for many years since these changes have happened. However, I get angry, I get irritable at certain things, and that feels very different to blame. The blame has a bitterness to it, it's an uncomfortableness in oneself. The anger it's sharp, it's usually vertical in time. There's no shame or blame after it, and it doesn't have a bitterness that the uncomfortableness with oneself has. So that to me is one of the questions that gets asked every now and again. You know, I think maybe 5 people in 10 years of me talking have asked me, do you... I assume a lot of people would assume that suffering doesn't arise, because otherwise I think it wouldn't be fair for me to be sitting here talking about happiness in the form of continuous unbroken peace of mind. But I think more people should ask the question if they don't know. If you go and listen to someone, firstly find out what they're talking about, because if they're talking about a state of oneness, they might be very good, or they might actually have a state of oneness. I'm not really interested in a state of oneness if suffering keeps arising. No? And then someone says, but there's no one who's suffering, there is just suffering arising, but it's still uncomfortable, isn't it? Yeah, but not for anyone. I think and then it's up to the individual to decide what they're really looking for. Are you looking for a state of oneness? Or are we interested in oneness because it comes with peace of mind? And if you could have the peace of mind without the oneness, what would you take? If you had the oneness but with suffering, what would you take? My experience says actually we're after peace of mind.
Oneness without suffering or suffering is not a good example, actually. Oneness is oneness. So there is no suffering or non-suffering. But as far as understood now, you say that suffering comes with a story, and this can go on for a long time. And a certain rush of anger, like in dangerous situation, or somebody's getting close to you with a scooter and you jump aside, is just a biological healthy reaction, maybe, in a way.
Mm-hmm. And so we can see it as a happening according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning a happening according to my biological structure, so a biological reaction, a happening that had to happen given my makeup and the circumstance I found myself in. And in the same way, if suffering arises, we hopefully can see it the same way, a psychological reaction, a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, a specific part of conditioning, that I believe I am the doer and my happiness is to be found in outcomes, right? And therefore the suffering happens. And if we can witness it just as we witness the biological reaction happening and be uninvolved in it, then we have the peace with the suffering and then the peace without the suffering. Eventually that suffering, the psychological reaction, will start to fall away if we continue to see that the psychological reaction is because of an involvement in it, an involvement in the pleasure or pain of life. There was a peace with the suffering because we, on the outer level, stopped becoming involved in the suffering. Right? We stopped becoming involved in the suffering because we understood, well, life is this singularity of experience, and suffering is just experience, part of the palette of life, part of the colors of life. And so let me not insist that the palette doesn't include that color on it. And that's where we became at peace with the suffering, when there was a non-involvement in the suffering. So if we can understand the same thing about the flow of life. So first we need to find this non-involvement in the primary involvement, non-involvement in the blame and shame and expectation. Then that non-involvement will filter its way down such that there is a non-involvement in the pleasure and pain of life. Meaning, the guest house owner cheats us. We have a biological reaction to that. We might say to them, like, hey, you said that, in a day's time I could move into this other room. It's now been 3 days and still it's not available. and you're charging me much more than I want in the room that I was meant to be in for just 1 day. Now it's 3 days. So a biological reaction can happen. That's part of the circumstance. But then it's after that, it's like that is pain in the moment. And if we find there is no involvement in the pain in the moment, then the blame that we were witnessing previously ceases to be there. So then no question of witnessing blame anymore.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. They're valuable. Okay.
Sir, I want to ask something, but I do not know how to make what I want to ask into sentences. So what I would do is I would use some words only to make a question. Words like possessiveness in a relationship, loyalty, morality, emotional quotient, righteousness, and the opposite of all of these words, opposites of all of these words. So let us say if there are 10 words, how many of them, or I mean, how many of them would come under how much degree of biological preference and attachment to outcome?
So in a relationship, there are two people. Life is interhuman relationship. The way that the people function is essentially circumstance, part of circumstance. And so one partner is, their circumstance is going to include the way the other partner is. And so on a biological level, according to their preferences, their biological preferences, there is going to be a appreciation or a appreciation or a non-appreciation of how the partner is functioning. And then there will be the inevitable attitude to the circumstance. Now, if the attitude is of doership and attachment to outcomes, the circumstance may trigger, blame or a resistance to the circumstance. If someone holds high standards, regardless of high standards, well, your question is a difference between biological preferences and attachment. So the clear, everyone has their characteristics that are going to deliver either pleasure or pain to us. Whether we feel pleasure or pain is a result of our biological preference. Whether there is suffering or peace of mind with the pleasure or pain is dependent on our attachment to outcomes.
Yes.
It's hard to answer your question more specifically than that, because there were a lot of words and they didn't all fit into one category.
Okay.
Okay, I don't know. This lady was next, before from the previous.
Thank you. Thanks for your teachings. So my question is about making choices in the flow of life.
Mm-hmm.
So I do feel, I do understand that this is not what will make me happy. This is not what makes me happy. Like the shape of, like, I don't know, what shop, what to stay in one place or in another one, or even to share with one person or not, because anyway, it will bring pain and suffering and pleasure, and
it will bring pleasure and pain.
pleasure and pain.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what you were going to say originally, that's
suffering
right.
is
Suffering is
rega-
optional in a sense, or not
Right.
really option, depends on the
State of
attitude
mind.
to the
Yeah.
pleasure or pain.
Exactly. Thank you for that. So it's not about that. No, it's not about the shape of it, but the attitude and the I will say the state of mind, how we look at things.
Mm-hmm.
So how to make choice then
Mm-hmm.
in that which doesn't make any difference at
Do
the
what
end
you-
of the day.
In each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do.
Sorry again.
In each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, understanding that whatever you think or feel to do is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, factors that you didn't put into control, you didn't put in place. Understand that the decision you make is part of destiny, and the outcome of the decision is also part of destiny.
So it doesn't really matter.
No. Ramesh used to say, it's already in the can. Right? Life has been written, acted, directed, produced, and it's in the can. And what is in the can unfolds moment after moment after moment for us to see. And the decisions that we say are my decisions are also in the can. Yeah?
Nice, thank you.
Okay. Someone who puts their hand up next.
First of all, I'll start with a quote that you used by Nisargadatta Maharaj. As far as I remember, his life was flowing in between the wisdom and love. Or in between, when he was love, he was everything, and when he was wisdom, he was nothing.
Yeah.
Yes. So, and you used it in between pain and pleasure, which is, I don't understand. Maybe this is a different quote. Who knows? Another thing, someone of the big guys said that suffering is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't choose it, you don't get it. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree with that?
It's very useful to say that as part of a teaching. Ultimately, as teachings tend to be progressive because our understanding changes. It's a bit like going through school. You know, in grade 1 they say this, and then we get changed because we've been in grade 1, and so then the teachings change in grade 2 and grade 3. So this, to highlight my point, and so you don't think I'm just making this up, in A Course of Miracles, which some people like and some people don't. But actually, it's when you look at it, it's a very comprehensive teaching, and it's set out into 365 lessons. And at one of the lessons, I think, let's say 127, I don't know, I'm just making up, but around somewhere there, it says the pleasure and pain of life, or pleasure or pain, is unavoidable. It's inevitable. You can't do anything about that. However, your attitude to pleasure or pain is your choice. Exactly what you said. And then another 100 lessons happen. And on lesson 220, it says, actually, even your attitude is not your choice. The reason that's done is that teachings are talking to the doer. And eventually the doer is what dissolves. And we need to be able to see that there is this difference between pleasure and pain and one's attitude. And it starts off when the attachment is really strong, that distinction is not even available to us. The whole experience happens and everything is mixed together, and it doesn't feel like there is circumstance in my attitude. There's, if you say that to some people, they have no idea what you're talking about. So teaching has to come along and point out that suffering is actually an attitude to circumstance. And so it sort of creates a distinction in the brain, in the intellect, that wasn't there before. And then it says, it uses whatever words. It says the flow of life you can't influence. That's outside of your control. But your attitude is in your control.
Is it really?
That's what the teachings will say, because it's helpful for us. We when our attention starts, when we start to see that there is this distinction between the flow of life and the attitude is seen as being one attitude, and then we say, well, I can change this. I can stop blaming. And it starts off where there's some cracks in the blaming, right? Where we see it changing. But in the end, we realize what's happened is life has reconditioned me. And the blaming stopped, not because I as a doer did it, but because life reconditioned me, and then the change as a result of the reconditioning started to happen. And I wasn't in control of how life reconditioned me. I wasn't in control of listening to the master that told me, the flow of life is not in your control. That is inevitably going to be pleasure, but your attitude is. See, so teachings are not the truth. Teachings are what is needed. And then we have to go past that teaching. That's why if it was the truth, we wouldn't let it go. We're always told, use this as a tool, like a boat to get across the river, but then don't carry the boat on your back forever. That's why in Buddhism, it's if you see Buddha on the road, kill him. Because Buddha is a representation of the Buddhist teaching. At some point, we need to go beyond the teachings. So the concept that says, your attitude is in your control is a very useful concept. It's not true. But it's useful. And when we're ready, something comes in and suggests, look at your attitude, and you'll see your attitude is a result of your genes and up-to-date conditioning. It happens. Blame happens. No blame happens. Or blame happens and the absence of blame happens according to your genes and up-to-date conditioning that you and I were never in control of. Everything, including our attitude, is part of God's will, part of the predetermined story of life. It's all happening, and we take it so seriously.
I just could contradict a little bit. You say that you are interested in the peace of mind, you are not interested in the oneness, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a contradiction. And you know what? Because when you say I, what do you mean by that? If you say I as an individual, as a body-mind combination, you will never get out of it. You know, you always have the suffering, because this is how life goes. This is the life, the law of life.
Yes.
But the identity is something that could be chosen. You can choose your identity. And if your identity is oneness, then whatever happens in life, you just accept it. And there is no I there. And then when there is no I, there is no expectation. And when there is no expectation, there is no suffering.
Yes.
Pain and pleasure, okay, please come and go. But then, where is the suffering? So, but when you deny this oneness, what kind of identity do you choose then?
Yes. So I'm not denying oneness. I'm saying that we're not looking for the experience of oneness. So these are subtle differences. Often people are waiting for an experience of oneness that will never leave. An experience where experientially there is no person. And the reason that obsession with an experience of oneness happens is because in these sort of teachings, Advaita teachings, it recognizes that the intellect grabs hold of information and thinks that it knows because it has information. And so the teachings keep telling us this understanding is not about the intellect, it's not about thinking. When Advaita talks about understanding or knowing with a capital U or capital K, it's talking about, this occurred to me the other day, is that when it says we are the awareness in which everything is known fully. That could be a description about our true nature from an Advaita point of view. And when we hear that, when the intellect that doesn't know that for itself, when the intellect hears that, it says, I am awareness that knows everything fully. It might think that knowing is something to do with like God, that knows everything, whereas that pointer is really saying the awareness in which everything that arises here is known because there is a direct oneness with it, right? A knowing of the objects as not separate from the awareness in which it arises. And so the use of the word knowing in Advaita and understanding, as I'm sure you're aware of, is to try and shift us out of the intellect that labels everything and thinks it knows something when it knows a name of it, when it knows how something works. And so those teachings are saying it's not an intellectual understanding. And then they talk about the end of separation or oneness. So what happens in the brain is the brain says it's not intellectual, what's being talked about, and the reality or the truth is oneness or the end of separation. And so by default, the brain says, it must be an experience, an experiential oneness that is the understanding and the knowing. And then the teachings talk about the end of the person, and so the intellect starts drawing a conclusion about what enlightenment actually is. From a different perspective, we can come to see that the end of separation doesn't necessarily mean a oneness experience. If we can come to see, because seeing is very different to intellectual book knowledge, for example. If we can see that everything is connected, if we can see that what I am in this moment is a result of everything that came before, that I am a result of the words coming out, a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, is one way of saying, Nisargadatta used to say the 5 elements. It's a more basic, essential way of saying that I am an extrusion out of life. So I can see if I, with the investigation and inquiries, there is no separate Roger. So even the sense of Roger that might be there is not a separate Roger. So it's then we see it's the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes, especially the personal doership, because personal doership says, I am an autonomous entity that is essentially insulated from life. That's what how we see ourselves. We don't see ourselves being connected to everything that came before and a result of everything that came before. That's the truth of the matter, that I am a result of everything. But the belief in personal doership says, I'm insulated from life, I'm unaffected by life, and I am the one that makes the decision as to where I'm going to go and where, what I'm going to do. So that's one way you can look at the separation. It's a psychological separation that has come in and disconnected me from life. Now, that seeing can be a very deep seeing, which is beyond just an intellectual understanding. It can be so deep that it uproots all of the hatred towards the other, because I see the other is part of life. They are a result of everything that came before, and I and the other weren't in control of everything that came before. And so they functioned in a way, that really hurt me, and there's no one there doing it. That's the deep understanding, but it has nothing to do with an experience of oneness. I've had many of the experiences of oneness where the sense of self becomes the all-pervading awareness in which everything arises, where there's no separation between the awareness that is aware of it, the objects which are made and pervaded by the awareness, the sense of the person falls away, there's a non-locality of the awareness, not centered in the body. That is a profound experience. It happens because certain beliefs and things in the body are changing, but it's not what my peace of mind is dependent on. I completely agree with you that if the me that sees itself as a separate independent entity is there, that is seeing the other as an enemy and a competitor, that is afraid, that is searching for outcomes in order to feel complete. If that's there can't be any peace. So the teachings of Advaita at certain stages need to be a little bit rudimentary, a bit blunt. So when they talk about no person, what they're really saying is there's no doer. Buddha, events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. Meaning, the human being is there. Events happen, deeds are done, consequences happen, but there is no individual doer thereof. And at first we have to the teaching starts, there is no person, because we only know ourselves as this doer. The person only knows itself as the doer. So in a way the teachings have to they can't be so specific as there is a person but they're not the doer. They need to say, there is no person. And then there is a integrating of that understanding that comes in, and an acceptance that actually I have to live my life as this person. Till the end of life, I am Roger. But so when I say I'm talking about Roger, this particular body-mind organism who understands deeply because the opposite understanding has been uprooted. That Roger is a result of life, and there really is no Roger as a separate independent doer, and there is no other. as a separate independent doer. Yet, on an experiential and practical basis, life is lived where Roger is separate from the other. In experience, I am not the tree. Roger, I can go into a state of, I don't know if you'd call it samadhi or meditation, where the sense of Roger falls over. You can't live your life continuously like that. Or you can, but at some point life says, actually, is there a problem if I became fully Roger again? That's what my guru worked on. Because I said to him that I was awareness. I was consciousness. All there is consciousness. He said, Roger, don't be ridiculous. Roger is speaking to Ramesh, and Ramesh listens. Then Ramesh speaks to Roger, and Roger listens. And I had come from the teachings of Nisargadatta that had sort of obliterated something. And experientially, I thought what the experience was telling me, and at that time I didn't think it was an experience, I was saying that is reality. Maya, separation, has fallen away, and now there is a recognition that all there is consciousness. What I am is consciousness. So I went to Ramesh for the first time in homage to Nisargadatta, because Nisargadatta was my teacher. And I found out that Ramesh was the translator for Nisargadatta. And something said, I want to go and pay my respects to Nisargadatta. I had never heard Ramesh's teaching. So I went to Mumbai for one day, where I would get one satsang. And I went, and I listened to what he was saying, and that night there were floods in Mumbai, and the airport was closed for 10 days, so I was forced to stay for 10 days. And in the course of that time and the following time with Ramesh, we had this discussion, and when I said consciousness is speaking with consciousness and consciousness is listening to consciousness, that's when Ramesh, I'm sure he understood where I was, and he said, Roger, don't be ridiculous. And I thought that maybe he didn't understand, because to me I didn't think this wasn't just some play of words, it was the experience that I was living. And only after some time did I realize where attention, because the teachings had to direct my attention elsewhere in order for a realization to happen, only after a while did I realize that attention had completely gone off the practical flow of life that was still here, had completely gone off acknowledging cause and effect, for example, acknowledging time. All of those were the things that had to be sort of discarded in order for a oneness to be seen. And then Ramesh said, hey, come back down and live as Roger. There's no problem living as Roger, as long as the suffering has been uprooted. When the suffering me is there, we get a great relief in becoming nobody. Because when the suffering dynamic is in our experience, once we become nobody and nothing is real, for example, and I am not the body, and therefore pleasure and pain is not so, I don't need to worry about it, it's just part of what is. The suffering dynamic gets sort of sedated. But are we maybe spiritually bypassing? At first it's not spiritual bypassing, at first it's sadhana, it's a breaking of the habit. Keep dropping into oneness or into beingness. The habit is so strong it needs to be broken. But at some point we start to realize, oh, I'm not meant to live out there. I'm not meant to live as nothing. That's why as everything, I won't bring that quote in. So come back, and I found, I get to live as Roger, enjoying the pleasures and enduring the pains with peace of mind. And it's much, much better than oneness, because as oneness you're nothing, right? And maybe it's a denial, it's a suppression of the person that is actually here. But the problem is the me, the doer. That has to be annihilated. And teachings are so clever, they've been designed because of insight, because of recognition, because of the understanding of the dynamics. And so they do what they need to do, and they sort of hand over from one to the other. That does something different. And so that's, there's a Zen saying that helps back up what I'm talking about here. Before the process of enlightenment, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. During the process of enlightenment, mountains and rivers were seen to be unreal. After enlightenment, mountains and rivers were real again. Which, and it's a bit before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, after enlightenment, chop. But there's a difference. The after is different. In this teaching, attachment to outcome and belief in personal doership has been annihilated. So just in conclusion, Ramesh would make it clear, what is it that we get after enlightenment that we didn't have before? He thought it was a good question to ask. And it's a great question. What you get after enlightenment that you didn't have before is nothing. Right? You lose. Yes, you have the absence of suffering. Before enlightenment, there was an ego, which is a word in this teaching referring not to the problem, but the human being. Before enlightenment, there was an ego, but that ego had the belief in attachment, had attachment to outcomes and the belief in personal doership. After enlightenment, there is still an ego, still a separate human being. Ramana continued to have to live his life as Ramana, looking after the ashram and teaching people, responding to his name when it was called. So in a way, that's proof that there is still a separate individual identified with name and form. If the identification with name and form dissolves, not the psychological identification with name and form, but the actual identification, if that had dissolved and someone says Bhagwan, there would be no response. But someone says Bhagwan, he said, yes, how can I help you? The identification, biological identification with name and form is still there. And for Ramana, if someone got a hammer and hit a rock, right, and he was in meditation, nothing would happen. If someone got the hammer and hit his knee when he was in meditation, a different story. So Ramana still knows himself relative to a particular body-mind organism. But the doership that disconnects him from the self has been annihilated. So I hope that sheds some light. So as not to push over the time, we probably should leave it there today, but I hope that we can carry these on over the next 6 days. So anyone who's enjoying what we're talking about, or at least feeling like it is relevant to this search, please, I invite you to come back. And what I wanted to do today, which I didn't because I saw some new faces, was maybe do an exploration into oneness, ironically. Experiential oneness, in a sense, a subtle experience. So we can create a shift where we see, I am, and I'm sure many of you know directly what I'm talking about, I am the awareness. But I want to point that out as an exercise, not reality. When that happens, what it's doing is it's alerting us, it's recognition has come on to the essence of the human being, the core of the human being, the consciousness that functions through this vehicle. And when the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcomes is there is the ego with that belief, which means that we are looking outward, and there simply is no connection, no recognition of the core of consciousness that is functioning through us. And it's only when that consciousness gets recognized by, you could say, by itself, but actually I would say it's the human being recognizing the awareness aspect of the human being. When that happens, we start to appreciate that there is this component, this aspect, this core to the human being, and it's been overlooked. And as that gets realized, we might find ourselves being able to drop into silence, into beingness more and more often, and that cuts off the habitual thinking mind. And so as well as providing the concepts, I think it's very important for us to be able to abide in I am. So an exploration of this, what I mean by this experience, the experience of the universe. This right here is the experience of the universe. That which arises within your field of awareness. If we think that one day we will know the universe beyond what is right here, because we think that we will have some godlike power of knowing the universe, then that idea takes us away from the simple exploration of this very present experience, which all arises within the human's field of awareness. Actually, the truth is we don't know if it's the human's field of awareness, but we definitely don't know that it is not the human's field of awareness. We get given concepts that help us, that say it is not the field of awareness of the human. Those concepts are not the truth necessarily. They're very useful at helping us to awaken to that consciousness. And then once that awakening has happened, if we are resting there, and if we are really truthful with ourselves, that which we might have been calling the awareness of God that is functioning through all of us, an awareness that was never born and will never die, all of these are very useful pointers for the awakening. But at some point I say, when I'm resting in, and when I say I, when Roger dissolves into beingness, do I have the information that says that this awareness was never born and will never die? Am I given I, as in that awareness, that is the awareness of God? So at some point we have to start, life will start getting us to be really honest with ourselves, beyond, very deep spiritual teachings. I mean, anyone who's on the Advaita path, Advaita is already, most seekers are not at all ready for an Advaita teaching. The belief in a me is far too strong for it to be at all appealing. Then even within the Advaita seeking, there is a fair amount of change that happens. And the awakening, to me, is very important, and it's in a way the beginning of an integration back into living life as the human being, hopefully free of suffering.